They gave me a bunk 3 decks below the Hive's outer membrane, in a chamber that smelled of wet copper and old light. There were no corridors, not the way we build them. The Hive moved around me, and I moved through the Hive, and neither of us was ever fully certain which was which. My name is Vora Sen. I was at the time a senior xenolinguistics attaché seconded to the Terran Consolidation Survey Office, 41 years old, with 17 years of contact-adjacent fieldwork behind me and no illusions about what any of it had prepared me for. The Hive had requested one human observer aboard during what they called a reckoning passage, a journey inward to a system they had charted but never described to us. Command agreed. I was the one they sent. I want to be precise about the Hive because most accounts get it wrong. They are not a swarm. They do not share a single mind in the way we used to imagine. What they share is a shared record, a continuous, living archive of everything every individual Hive node has ever perceived, indexed and cross-referenced down to the chemical. Their civilization is built not on language but on accumulated evidence. They do not argue about what happened. They have the record. They consult it. That is their governance, their religion, and their science, all at once. What I did not know, when I boarded the Hive Vesketh Solaran at the edge of mapped space, was that a substantial portion of that archive was about us. I learned it on the 19th day. We had dropped below the plane of the system's ecliptic, and I was working in my bunk chamber, cataloging the Hive's secondary vocalization signals, when the node I had come to think of as my primary contact, I called it Reach, because it was always the one that extended the first tendril of communication, came to find me. It did not knock. It filled the doorframe with its upper body, and waited, and when I looked up, it placed a single pulsed sequence into the air between us. The sequence meant, "We are ready to show you." I had heard that phrase before in Hive exchanges, in the context of trade data, navigation charts, biological surveys. I assumed it meant they had something to share about the system we were entering. I said yes. I followed. Reached down through the membrane passages to the archive chamber at the vessel's center. What I found there was not a chart. The chamber held 10,000 light points, each one a fragment of recovered signal or material evidence, arranged in the rough shape of a human being, not a biological schematic, a portrait. At the center was a dead Pioneer-class probe, recovered from a debris field in a system we had abandoned 40 years ago. Around it radiated the signals, each tagged with coordinates and a timestamp. The first broadcast we ever aimed at deep space, a school experiment from a station orbiting the 5th planet. The electromagnetic ghost of a reactor test at the edge of the Kareth run. The hull plate shard recovered from a scout that had jumped badly and come apart. A translation attempt, clumsy and partial, that one of our own linguists had transmitted 6 years ago, on the assumption no one was listening. Someone had been listening. The Hive had built its portrait of humanity from everything we had leaked into the dark without meaning to. Not from our diplomacy, not from our official transmissions, from the things we had discarded, abandoned, or simply failed to retrieve. And the portrait was accurate in the way that only evidence assembled without flattery can be. It showed a species that built things to last, then left them when they could. It showed a species whose first impulse on meeting a problem was to measure it, and whose second impulse was to name it, and whose third impulse was to send something toward it before the naming was finished. It showed a species that had transmitted music into the dark before it had transmitted coordinates, because someone had decided that the music mattered more. Reach stood beside me while I absorbed this. It did not explain. The Hive does not explain, presents the record, and waits. I stood in that portrait for what I think was 2 hours, and when I finally turned to Reach, I had to work very hard to keep my voice level. I asked it why. Why had they assembled this? What did it mean that they had spent, by my rough count, better part of for 40 years building this record in secret? Reach gave me a sequence I had never heard before. I have spent every year since trying to render it in language it was never designed to carry. The closest I have come is, we needed to understand what we would be meeting before we could decide whether to meet it. That was first contact. Not a ship, not a fleet, not a weapon. A room full of everything we had ever let slip into the dark, arranged into the shape of what we were, by a mind that had been waiting patiently for us to amount to something worth meeting. I transmitted a report to Consolidation Command that night. I told them what I had found. I told them the Hive was not hostile, that their archive showed no military preparation, that the Reckoning passage appeared to be a deliberate invitation to witness the portrait before the Hive made any formal contact through official channels. I recommended a diplomatic response. One ship, one crew, no weapons array. Command sent the Ion's Pale Witness, a courier-class vessel, lightly crewed, exactly what I had asked for. The Pale Witness dropped out of jump 4 days later at the edge of the system. I was on the Hive archive deck when it arrived, watching the Hive node's process, its sensor returns, with what I had learned to read as something close, satisfaction. Reach was beside me. The archive chamber was lit with the soft copper orange of the archive's active state. What I did not know, what no one aboard the Pale Witness knew, what Consolidation Command had no file on, was that not all of the Hive agreed. The Hive is not one vessel. It is not even one consensus. The archive is shared, but the conclusions drawn from it are not always the same. Is a clade within the Hive, old, patient, and wrong, in a way that very old things can be wrong, that had read the same portrait I had stood inside and drawn from it a different answer. Not that we were worth meeting, that we were worth ending before we could become what the record suggested we were becoming. The Pale Witness was destroyed in 11 seconds, not by the xenolinguistics, by 3 Hive vessels that had been running cold in the system's outer debris field, invisible, waiting. I felt it through the archive. The Hive records everything. I felt the moment the Pale Witness's reactor signature disappeared, and I felt Reach go rigid beside me, and I heard, for the first and only time in my experience of Hive communication, something that I can only describe as a sound of grief, not a human grief, an archival grief, the grief of a record that has just received data it did not want to contain. What happened next I know from the archive. The Keth Mind Solaran's commander, a Hive mind designation I cannot render in any human syllable formally, excised the dissident clade from the shared record. This is the Hive's equivalent of a court sentence, a declaration of war, and a funeral, at once. The 3 vessels that had destroyed the Pale Witness were cut off from the archive they had been part of for centuries. They jumped, and the Hive did not track them. I was taken to a secondary chamber and given what the Hive's records told them a human needed after loss. Silence, warmth, something that approximated water. Reach sat at the chamber's threshold and did not leave. I had no way to reach command. Pale Witness was gone. I was the only human in that system, on a vessel I could not pilot, in a species care that had just demonstrated the full depth of its internal fractures and the full precision of its affection. Spoke to me once more before we began the long transit back to the boundary of known space. It placed a single sequence into the air. I have turned that sequence over for 9 years. The best rendering I have is this. The record now includes you. Pale Witness carried 31 crew. I know their names. I have written them down in more places than I can count, because the Hive archive holds them perfectly. And I have always been afraid of what it would mean if only the Hive remembered. But they do remember. That much I know for certain. Somewhere in the living archive of the xenolinguistics, indexed and cross-referenced and preserved without flattery, 31 human beings are part of the record of what first contact cost. It is not the memorial I would have chosen. It may be the most enduring one they will ever have.